"Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from that elevator." Gerald Whitfield planted himself between the man and the doors, the way a man plants himself when he has decided a thing is already settled. He was the general manager of the Alderton Grand. He had been the general manager of the Alderton Grand for 11 years. He wore his authority the way he wore his suit, pressed, certain, slightly too tight across the shoulders, and he spoke the way men like him speak to men like the one standing in front of him. Not loudly, not rudely in any way a bystander could later specify, but with a particular calibrated flatness that communicated, without stating, that this conversation was already over, and that one of the two parties present did not yet know it. The man Gerald Whitfield was addressing was not arguing. He was not raising his voice. He was not doing anything except standing in the lobby of the Alderton Grand at 20 minutes past 7 on a Tuesday evening, dressed in a plain gray sweatshirt, dark jeans, and a pair of shoes that were unremarkable and clean, holding a small duffel bag in one hand and in the other hand a key card, a penthouse key card, matte black, no hotel branding, the kind issued only to guests of the 14th floor. His name was Marcus. He looked at Gerald Whitfield. He did not step back. He did not raise his voice. He said very quietly, "I'm a guest here." Gerald Whitfield said, "Sir, the penthouse level requires verification. I'm going to have to ask you to speak with someone at the front desk." It was the word verification that did it, not what it meant, but how he said it, like a door closing, like a word that had been waiting behind his teeth since the moment this man walked through the lobby. 14 people were in that lobby. Not one of them moved, not one of them spoke. They watched a man in a suit position himself between another man and an elevator, and every person in that lobby understood, at some level that did not require explanation, what was actually happening. What Gerald Whitfield did not understand, what he could not have known, standing in his pressed suit in the lobby he had managed for 11 years, was that the man in the gray sweatshirt owned the lobby. He owned the elevator. He owned the 14th floor. He owned all 14 floors, the parking structure beneath them, and the land on which the building stood. And in 4 minutes, he was going to know it. Have you ever watched someone decide what you are before you've said a single word? Have you ever stood in a room that was yours and been asked to prove you belonged there? Let me take you back. 2 years, before this lobby, before Gerald Whitfield, before any of this. Let me take you back to where Marcus Ellington begins. The neighborhood where Marcus grew up did not have a name that appeared on the kind of maps that real estate developers consulted. It was the kind of place that people from other places drove through on their way somewhere else and did not think about afterward. The apartment on Farwell Avenue was on the 3rd floor of a 6-story building that had been built in 1961 and maintained with approximately the commitment you would expect from an owner who had never once spent a night there. The boiler broke every February. The elevator had been out of service for so long that the handwritten "out of order" sign on the door had faded to near illegibility and then been replaced with an identical one, and then that one had faded too. There were 4 apartments on the 3rd floor. The Ellington family occupied 3C. Marcus's father, Theodore Ellington, was a man who worked with his hands and his mind in roughly equal measure, and who had decided, sometime in his early 30s, that those two things were not as separate as people liked to pretend. He was a building engineer, not the title on a business card kind, but the actual kind, the kind who understood the relationship between a structure and the ground it sat on, who could read a blueprint the way other people read a newspaper, who could walk into a building and feel, in the way a doctor feels a patient's pulse, whether it was healthy or sick. He worked for a facilities management company for 22 years. He came home from every shift with something in his jacket pocket, a hardware store receipt, a contractor's estimate, a folded piece of paper on which he had written down a number or a measurement or a question he had been turning over since lunch. He had a leather-bound notebook, dark green, with a brass clasp on the side. He had kept it since before Marcus was born. It was the thing Marcus associated most with his father, more than his face, almost, or his voice. The green notebook at the kitchen table, under the fluorescent light that buzzed faintly, and that had been on Marcus's mother's list for Theodore to fix for approximately 2 years before he got around to it. The pen moving in the unhurried way his father moved when he was thinking. Theodore reading something back to himself under his breath, lips moving just slightly, the way a person reads when they are making sure the words are holding the weight of the thing they are trying to say. The notebook was not organized the way you might expect. It was not a journal, not a log. It was closer to a conversation Theodore was having with himself across years. A question written in November, an answer written the following March, a note beside that answer in a different ink added later still, saying simply, still true, or occasionally, wrong. See page 41. There was an intimacy to it that made Marcus feel, even as a child, that he was reading something he had been trusted with, rather than something he was simply allowed to see. His father was many things, but he was most himself in those pages, patient, rigorous, willing to be wrong in writing, which is the hardest kind of wrong to be, because it is permanent, and there is no revising your memory of it afterward. Marcus had asked him once what he wrote in it. Theodore had thought about this for a moment, the way he thought about things, without rushing, and then he had said, problems, and what I think the answer might be, and whether I was right. He said, most people only write down the problems. He said, if you want to learn anything, you have to write down whether you were right. Marcus was 11 when his father said that. He did not fully understand it then. He understood it later, in the way that the things fathers say become legible only after time has given you enough experience to decode them. Theodore Ellington died of a heart attack at 53, when Marcus was 19. He died on a Tuesday in February, in the stairwell of a building on the east side, where the boiler had broken again, and the building engineer had been called at 11 at night, because the tenants on the upper floors had no heat and the temperature outside was 4 degrees. He had fixed the boiler. He had been walking back down the stairs when his heart stopped. They said he had likely had the condition for years and hadn't known. They said he hadn't suffered. Marcus did not know how they could say that with certainty, but he decided to believe them because the alternative was a thing he could not carry and still function. What he kept, the only object from his father's life that he would not release under any circumstance, the thing that sat in every office he ever worked in and every home he ever lived in, was the green leather notebook with the brass clasp. He kept it in a small wooden box. He did not write in it. He had bought his own notebooks, plain ones, black covers, nothing engraved, and he had been writing in them since the week after the funeral. Problems and what he thought the answer might be, and whether he was right. He had filled 31 of them by the time he was 38. What was in those notebooks? And this is the part that requires understanding if you want to understand everything that came after. Was not a diary. Was not sentiment. Was mathematics and logic and the patient accumulation of understanding about a single subject. Real property, buildings, land. The relationship between a structure and the neighborhood that surrounded it, and the systems that governed both. He had started reading about real estate finance at 20, in the months after the funeral, partly because his father had always said there was no asset more honest than land. It was either there or it wasn't. It was worth something or it wasn't, and nobody could argue you out of it if you owned it outright. He read everything, not just the popular books, the quick flip guides, and the investor handbooks, but the technical literature, the academic papers on urban development, the zoning histories of specific neighborhoods, the case law on easements and air rights and historic preservation constraints. He read the way his father had read blueprints, looking for the relationship between things, looking for the load-bearing element that everything else depended on. By 24, he had purchased his first property, a single-family home in a neighborhood that was, at the time, the kind of neighborhood the developer's maps overlooked. He had saved the down payment over 3 years while working 2 jobs. Warehouse logistics during the day, building maintenance in the evenings. The second job chosen specifically because it let him learn the maintenance side of what he was studying on paper. He negotiated the purchase himself. He managed the property himself. He made every decision out of a black notebook. He was right more often than he was wrong. By 30, he had 7 properties. By 35, he had 23 properties, a small property management firm with 4 employees, and a reputation in certain circles, not the glamorous circles, not the ones with magazine profiles and TED stages, but the circles where people who actually understand real estate talk to each other. As someone whose analysis was unusually precise and whose word, once given, was not revised, by 38, he had begun the acquisition that would define everything that followed. The Alderton Grand had been built in 1987 on a full city block in what had become, in the intervening decades, one of the most desirable corridors in the city. It was 14 stories, 247 rooms, a full-service hotel with 2 restaurants, a rooftop bar, and a reputation as the kind of establishment that attracted the kind of guests who do not ask what things cost. It had been owned, for the prior 9 years, by a hospitality group called Hartwell Meridian Partners, a privately held company with a portfolio of 11 properties, and a managing partner named Clifton Hartwell, who had inherited the company from his father and had spent 12 years maintaining its value without substantially growing it. Clifton Hartwell was 61 years old and wanted to retire. His 2 sons had no interest in the hotel business. He had been trying to find a buyer for the Alderton Grand, specifically for nearly 3 years, without success, because the building was encumbered by a historic preservation covenant that limited certain renovations, and because there was a below-market ground lease on part of the parking structure that wouldn't expire for another 14 years and that any conventional hotel investor regarded as a complication. Marcus Ellington read the covenant and the ground lease on a Sunday afternoon and spent 2 hours in his notebook working through the structure. He called Clifton Hartwell on Monday morning. He said, "I've read everything. I think I understand the lease issue differently than you do. I'd like to talk." They talked for 4 hours. Clifton Hartwell later said it was the most technically specific conversation he had had about that property in 3 years of trying to sell it. He said the man across the table had read the ground lease more carefully than Hartwell's own attorneys had. He said he knew within the first hour that he was going to sell the building to this person. The deal closed 14 months later. $47.3 million, the largest single acquisition Marcus Ellington had ever made. He did not do a press release. He did not do an interview. He updated the LLC registration with the county recorder, and he wrote in his notebook, "Alderton Grand, acquired now. Understand it." He spent the first 3 months of ownership visiting the property incognito. Not as an inspection, not with clipboards or consultants, but the way his father had walked into buildings, quietly, attentively, trying to feel what was healthy and what was sick. He stayed in different rooms. He ate in both restaurants. He sat at the rooftop bar. He spoke to guests and to staff in the way that a man who is genuinely curious and unhurried speaks to people, and he listened to what they said. He wore plain clothes every time. He had no interest in being recognized. He had no interest in the performance of ownership. What he found, and this becomes important, was a hotel that was physically beautiful and operationally proud and culturally, in certain specific ways, unwell. There were patterns in the guest complaints he had reviewed. There were patterns in the staff turnover data. And there was one name that appeared with statistical consistency in the intersection of both sets of patterns. Gerald Whitfield. But Marcus was patient. He was always patient. He wanted to understand before he acted. He wanted to write it in the notebook and know whether he was right. He had given himself 6 months to observe. He was on month 5 when he walked into the lobby on a Tuesday evening in a gray sweatshirt with a duffel bag and a matte black penthouse keycard, and Gerald Whitfield stepped between him and the elevator. Now let me tell you exactly what happened in that lobby. Let me take you back to those 4 minutes, because what followed was not an accident, and it was not a surprise. Not to everyone present. Marcus had called ahead that day. Not to the front desk, to the concierge, a man named Daniel Ossie, who had worked the evening concierge desk at the Alderton Grand for 6 years, and who was, by the honest assessment of anyone who worked in that building, the person most responsible for the experience of guests who became guests again. Daniel Ossie was originally from Accra, had been in this city for 14 years, had a hospitality certification and a memory for names and preferences that other staff described, half in admiration and half in genuine bewilderment, as something close to supernatural. He knew what every regular guest drank before dinner. He remembered the names of their children. He had, on 2 separate occasions, sourced an impossible-to-find item for a guest within 30 minutes of being asked, through a network of contacts and goodwill he had spent 6 years assembling. He also knew, as of 3 months ago, who owned the building. Marcus had introduced himself to Daniel quietly, on a Tuesday evening very much like this one, over the concierge desk, and had told him his name and his role, and had asked Daniel. In the same unhurried way, he asked everyone everything, whether he would be willing to simply continue doing his job well and let Marcus observe the operation honestly. He had not asked Daniel to report on colleagues. He had not asked him to do anything other than what he was already doing. But he had given Daniel a number to call if anything occurred that Daniel believed warranted immediate attention. On this Tuesday evening, at 23 minutes past 7, Daniel Osei made that call. He made it from the concierge desk, 12 feet from the elevator bank, while Gerald Whitfield was explaining to the man in the gray sweatshirt that verification was required, and that he would need to step away from the elevator. He did not dial a manager. He did not dial the front desk. He dialed the number Marcus had given him. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. He already knew why Daniel was calling. Daniel was standing right there. Daniel could see everything. Marcus understood what the call meant. He did not answer it. He did not need to. He did something else. He reached into the duffel bag and he removed the green leather notebook with the brass clasp. His father's notebook. He set it on the concierge desk beside him, not as a gesture, not for anyone's benefit, but the way he always said it when he was about to do something that his father would have wanted to see done right. The way a person crosses themselves before they walk into something difficult. He set it down, and he straightened, and he looked at Gerald Whitfield, and he said, in a voice that was completely, utterly calm, "I'd like to speak with the property's legal representative. Can you get them on the phone, please?" Gerald Whitfield blinked. He had not expected that. He said, "Sir, this is really a very simple." Marcus said, "The property representative, on the phone. Now please, there is a kind of stillness that is not passivity. There is a kind of calm that does not ask permission." It was that kind of calm. The kind his father had, reading blueprints at the kitchen table at 11 at night. The kind that comes from knowing the load-bearing element in any structure, and understanding that panic is what happens to people who haven't done the reading. The lobby had gone very quiet. Gerald Whitfield looked at the man in the gray sweatshirt. He looked at the green notebook on the concierge desk. He looked at Daniel Osei, who was standing with his phone in his hand and his face arranged in an expression of complete professional neutrality that Gerald Whitfield had, in 11 years, never been able to read. He said, "Sir, I don't think that's necessary, sir," Daniel said. "Mr. Whitfield." Gerald turned. Daniel said, very quietly, very carefully, the way a person says a thing they have been holding for a long time. "He owns the building." The silence in that lobby was absolute. Gerald Whitfield's face did not collapse slowly. It went all at once. The certainty, that particular, loaded certainty he had been wearing since the moment this man walked through the door, drained out of him in a single second, and what was left was something much smaller and much less certain. And the 14 people in that lobby watched it happen and did not look away. He said, and his voice had changed, something structural had left it. "I'm sorry?" Daniel said, "Mr. Marcus Ellington. He is the owner of this property. He acquired it 14 months ago." A pause. "I should have said something sooner. That's on me." Marcus picked up the green notebook from the concierge desk. He tucked it back into the bag. He looked at Gerald Whitfield for a moment, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the same unhurried regard he brought to every problem he had decided to solve. He said, "We'll talk in the morning. Have someone from your management team available at 9 o'clock. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. He stepped in. The doors closed. Nobody in that lobby said anything for a long time. Go back and watch the lobby recording. If you ever get the chance to see the full version, not the 47 seconds Priya Anand captured on her phone, the full security footage, the 9 minutes from Marcus's entry to the elevator closing. Watch the moment Whitfield first sees him walk through the door. Watch how quickly the calculation happens. It is less than 3 seconds from the door opening to Whitfield moving toward the elevator. 3 seconds. That is not a decision made from evidence. That is a decision made from a place that evidence does not reach. But what Gerald Whitfield didn't know, what none of the 14 witnesses in that lobby knew yet, was that the meeting Marcus had scheduled for 9 o'clock in the morning was not the only thing he had scheduled, because Marcus had been patient for 5 months. And patience, when it finally moves completely. The morning meeting lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. It was held in the Alderton Grand's executive conference room on the 2nd floor, a room that Gerald Whitfield had occupied for 11 years as though it were his personal domain. The long mahogany table, the leather chairs, the wall of windows overlooking the street. A room that he walked into on this particular Wednesday morning and found already occupied by Marcus Ellington, who was sitting at the head of the table with a black notebook open in front of him and a cup of coffee he had made himself in the executive kitchen, and 2 other people. A woman named Adrienne Cole, who was a senior partner at the employment law firm that handled the building's legal matters, and a man named James Okafor, who was the director of operations for Ellington Property Group. Gerald Whitfield had not known, until this moment, that there was an Ellington Property Group. He had not known, until this moment, that the building he had managed for 11 years had changed hands. He had not been told. Not because the information was secret, the LLC transfer was public record, but because no one had thought to tell him, and he had not thought to ask, and this was itself a symptom of the condition Marcus had spent 5 months documenting. The meeting was not a performance. It was not theatrical. Marcus did not raise his voice. He opened the black notebook, and he went through what was in it, the way his father had gone through blueprints, systematically, without drama, identifying the load-bearing elements. He had 6 months of data, guest satisfaction scores, parsed by demographic category, and cross-referenced with the front-of-house staff schedules. Complaint logs, with patterns of occurrence by shift and by supervising manager. Staff exit interviews, obtained through the HR records the new ownership had been legally entitled to review since the acquisition. 3 third-party audit reports from the building's prior management company, all of which had flagged inconsistent application of guest service standards in language that was corporate and careful, but meant, in plain English, exactly what Marcus now said plainly and without corporate language. He also had the pattern of how those flags had been received. This was, perhaps, the most instructive data of all. Each of the 3 audit reports had been submitted to Clifton Hartwell's managing director at Hartwell Meridian Partners, a man named Preston Rowe who had been in his role for 8 years, and who had, across 3 reports in 4 years, responded with a variation of the same phrase, "We will take this under advisement and work with the property's general manager to address." The auditor's recommendations had been taken under advisement. They had been worked with. Nothing had changed. Gerald Whitfield had received a performance bonus in the year each report was issued. Not a large bonus, but a bonus. The message in a bonus, when the message a report is sending is disregarded, is not ambiguous. He also had 5 months of his own observation. He had been in this building 16 times. He had notes from every visit. He had the incident from last night witnessed by 14 people and captured on the lobby security system, which had been recording continuously, and which now showed, with perfect clarity, a uniformed general manager physically blocking a black man from an elevator in the hotel's own lobby while that man held, visibly, the penthouse key card issued only to the building's ownership. Gerald Whitfield sat very still during all of this. He had the look of a man who has spent 11 years standing on ground he believed was solid and is now understanding, in real time, that he has been standing on the ceiling. At the end of the presentation, Marcus closed the notebook. He said, "I want to be direct with you. What happened last night was not an isolated incident. The data I've described represents a pattern of conduct that has cost this hotel guests, has cost this hotel staff, and has created legal exposure that I am now responsible for inheriting. "I did not acquire this property to litigate it. I acquired it to improve it," he said. "You are being terminated from your position as general manager. Adrian will walk you through the separation terms. We'll ask you to be out of the building by noon." He said it the way his father would have said something true, without cruelty, without pleasure. The way you say a thing that has been said by the facts already and only needs a voice. Gerald Whitfield did not argue. He seemed, in some fundamental way, to have run out of things to say. By noon he was gone. But the story did not end there. It was only just finding its shape. One of the 14 witnesses in the lobby on Tuesday evening was a woman named Priya Anand, who worked in finance 3 blocks away and had been in the Alderton Grand lobby, waiting to meet a colleague for dinner. She had her phone in her hand when it happened. Not recording, not intentionally, but the camera had been opened from a text message exchange and the video was running. 47s, the gray sweatshirt, the general manager's posture, the phrase, "I'm going to need you to step away from that elevator," the stillness. And then Daniel Osie's voice, quiet but perfectly audible on the recording, saying the sentence, "He owns the building." She had not been sure whether to post it. She sat with it for a day. She sent it to 2 friends, one of whom was a journalist who covered business and real estate for a regional outlet, and that journalist, a man named Kwame Asare, who had been covering commercial real estate in this city for 9 years and who recognized the name Alderton Grand the moment he heard it, published a story within 36 hours. The headline was simple. New Alderton Grand owner was blocked from his own elevator. It ran with the 47-second video. By the end of the first day, the video had been viewed 1.8 million times. By the end of the second day, 3.2 million. The story was picked up by 17 outlets, then 31, then national, television segments, radio. The comment sections of every posting were, in the specific way of the internet, illuminating. Not primarily for the outrage which was expected, but for the number of people who showed up to say, "This has happened to me." Not the ownership reversal, that part was unusual, but the lobby, the elevator, the word verification, the particular calibrated flatness of a voice that has decided what you are. The hashtag was 2 words. They were the 2 words Daniel Osie had said, "Who's the building?" It did not stay about one building, it never does. It became the shorthand for a thing that had been happening in lobbies and conference rooms and boardrooms and waiting rooms and service entrances for a very long time, and that had a new name now, and that name was specific enough to be useful. Within 48 hours, the phrase had been used in over 60,000 posts. People used it to describe experiences from 10 years ago, 20 years ago. They used it with photographs of their parents, of their grandparents, of family members who had built businesses and bought property and walked into rooms and been handed the particular version of the word verification that had nothing to do with their credentials and everything to do with their face. The specificity of it, those 4 words, the way they contained an entire history in a single sentence, was what made it travel. It was not outrage at an abstraction. It was testimony about a very particular, very precise, very recognizable moment. The moment when a door is supposed to open and it doesn't, and the only explanation is the one nobody says out loud. 347 people tagged the Alderton Grand's official account in the first 48 hours. 112 of them described similar experiences at the hotel by name, with dates and details specific enough to be cross-referenced. Adrian Cole's legal team documented each one. The legal consequences came in several directions and moved faster than anyone anticipated. Within a week of the story's publication, 3 former employees of the Alderton Grand under Whitfield's management, a front desk associate, a housekeeping supervisor, and a restaurant host, had contacted Adrian Cole's firm independently, without coordination, to describe their own experiences working under Gerald Whitfield. The descriptions were consistent. The patterns were consistent. They were consistent with what was in Marcus's notebook and consistent with the data he had presented in the conference room and consistent with the exit interview records and consistent with what a great many people, over a great many years, had tried to report through formal channels and found those channels did not lead anywhere. Adrian Cole filed a civil action. It named Whitfield and named the prior ownership group, Hartwell Meridian Partners, whose HR practices had governed the period in question. Clifton Hartwell, contacted for comment, released a statement through his attorney saying he was committed to a thorough review. 71, he was retired. He had sold the building and he believed he was done with it. He was not done with it. The complaint ran 61 pages. It documented 11 years of conduct, supported by employee records, complaint logs, the security footage, and the 47-second lobby video that 3.2 million people had now seen. The damages sought were substantial. The case settled 18 months later for an amount that the parties agreed not to disclose publicly, though several people involved described it, in general terms, as significant enough to matter. The city's Hotel and Hospitality Association convened an emergency working group on bias in guest services within 3 weeks of the story's publication. This was not something the association had previously seen as within its mandate. It was now. They brought in an outside consultant, a firm that specialized in audit and training for service sector bias. They published a framework for equitable guest service standards 6 months later. It was adopted voluntarily by 43 member hotels. It was adopted in modified form by 7 others. 2 declined. Their names were not included in the press release, but the press release listed all 52 hotels consulted, and the math was available to anyone who wanted to do it. The framework was credited, in part, to a working paper co-authored by Kwame Asare, the journalist, and a researcher from the university's Urban Studies program. The working paper cited the Alderton Grand incident as a case study in what it called status inference failure in service environments. The tendency of service professionals to assign social status based on appearance and to make access decisions on that basis, with racially correlated patterns of error. It was read by a number of people who had been wanting a name for the thing they had been documenting for a long time. Names matter. They make things possible that weren't possible before. What happened to the Alderton Grand itself is the part that deserves to be told carefully. Marcus Ellington spent the 3 months after the acquisition closing redesigning the management structure from the building up, not the physical building. The physical building, as he had noted in his first visit, was genuinely excellent, a monument to the craft of the people who had built it in 1987 and of the maintenance staff who had kept it. He was not interested in renovating something that was already right. He was interested in the thing that his 5 months of notebooks had identified as sick. He promoted Daniel Osei to Director of Guest Experience, a newly created role reporting directly to the new general manager, with authority over the front-of-house service protocols across the entire property. Daniel's acceptance of the role was quiet, in the way Daniel did everything. He said he was honored. He said he had been at this hotel for 6 years because he believed in what a hotel could be when it decided to truly take care of people. He said he was glad to have the tools now. The new general manager was a woman named Francine Osei Bonsu, no relation to Daniel, who had run a boutique property in the city's arts district for 4 years and had built it from a standing start into one of the highest-rated hotels in the region. She was 41. She was methodical. She was the kind of person who read the complaint logs with the same attention Marcus brought to exit interviews, and she and Marcus had spoken twice before he offered her the role, and both times she had asked him questions. He later wrote down because they were better than the questions he had prepared. Under Francine and Daniel, the Alderton Grand's guest satisfaction scores rose 22 points in the first year. Staff turnover, which had been running at 58% annually under the prior management, a number that sits in the upper quartile for hotels its size and that costs conservatively between $8,000 and $12,000 per departure in recruitment and training, fell to 19%. 19% in 1 year. Not because of a program, not because of a policy document, because people who had been told for years that what they saw was not what they saw were finally working in a building that asked them what they saw. The Alderton Grand was named in its second year under Ellington Property Group as one of the top 50 hotels in the country by a major travel publication. The review specifically cited the service culture, The reviewer used the phrase, "a rare sense that the people who work here have been trusted," without knowing, or perhaps knowing perfectly well, the specific history that had produced it. Marcus read the review in his office, in the chair where he always read things, with the green notebook. His father's notebook, the one with the brass clasp, sitting on the corner of the desk the way it always sat. He read it twice. He opened the black notebook, his own, and he wrote a single line. Was right. He was right. On a Thursday evening in October, 14 months after the lobby incident, the Alderton Grand held a staff recognition event in the ballroom on the second floor. It was not a large event, and it was not covered by any press outlet. Marcus had not invited press. It was an internal thing, 74 employees, their families where they had brought them. A dinner catered by the hotel's own kitchen, whose head chef was a man who had been on the verge of resigning 6 months before the change in management and had decided, in the weeks after Francine arrived, to stay. Several employees were recognized that evening. Daniel Osei was one of them. He received a standing ovation from everyone in the room, including people who had not been there on the Tuesday evening and who knew the story only from what their colleagues had told them. And the story, passing through people who loved this building, had grown richer and more precise in the retelling rather than less. Marcus spoke briefly. He did not speak about himself. He spoke about his father, about the green notebook, about the specific instruction his father had given him at a kitchen table in an apartment on Farwell Avenue when Marcus was 11 years old. He said, "Write down the problems, write down what you think the answer might be, and then write down whether you were right," he said. "The bravest thing you can do is commit to the second and third steps." Most people stop at the problem. They decide the problem is the destination. It isn't. The problem is just the first entry. He said, "Every person in this room has been part of proving something right. I want you to know," I wrote it down. In the back corner of the room, a young front desk associate named Tomas, who had been hired 4 months earlier and who had never worked anywhere like this, leaned over to the person beside him and said quietly, "Is he always like this?" The person beside him, a housekeeper who had worked the Alderton Grand for 8 years, through the old management and the new, through all of it, said, "He's getting better." 1 year after that evening, Ellington Property Group announced the Ellington Osei Foundation for Equitable Hospitality, named for Marcus's father, Theodore Ellington, and for Daniel Osei's mother, a woman named Abena Osei, who had worked as a hotel housekeeper in Accra for 22 years, and who was alive and living with Daniel's family in this city, and who was, at the announcement, sitting in the third row with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes bright, and who did not make a sound, but whom everyone who looked at her remembered afterward. The foundation provides grants to hospitality programs at historically black colleges and universities, funds bias audit programs for hotel groups that apply, and runs a fellowship for early career hotel professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. 11 fellows in its first year, 23 in its second. It is also the primary funder of the city's first hospitality ombudsman office, an independent body that receives and investigates guest service complaints on behalf of visitor who would not otherwise have a route to accountability. In its first year, the Ombudsman Office received 214 complaints. It substantiated 91 of them. It issued recommendations to 37 hotels. 32 of those hotels made the changes requested. 4 of the 5 that did not lost their certification with the city's Hospitality Association. 214 complaints. 91 substantiated. 32 changed. Those are not abstract numbers. Each one is a lobby. Each one is an elevator. Each one is a person who said, "This happened to me, and I want it written down." And now it is. If this story moved something in you, if some part of it landed in a place that you recognize, like it, share it, pass it to someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to find more stories like this one. And before you leave, I want you to put one thing in the comments. The lobby moment in your own life. The room where someone decided who you were before you spoke. What did you do with it? Here's what really gets me when I sit with all of this and think about what it means. It's not the manager. I need to say that clearly. Gerald Whitfield is the least interesting person in this story. He is, to be honest, almost a vehicle for a thing that did not originate in him and would not end with him. 11 years of a system that rewarded a certain kind of certainty, a certainty about who belongs where and what certain kinds of people are doing in certain kinds of lobbies. He did not invent that system. He inherited it, and he used it, and he was comfortable in it, and that comfort was the real damage. What gets me is the notebook. The green one. Theodore Ellington's green leather notebook with the brass clasp, carried into a lobby, set on a concierge desk in the presence of a man who had just decided that Marcus Ellington did not belong there. Marcus did not say, "I own this building." He did not announce himself. He set his father's notebook on the desk and asked for a legal representative. He set down the thing that had made him, the habit of mind, the instrument of understanding, and he asked for accountability through the proper channel. That is a form of dignity that cannot be conferred by any deed of ownership. It was there before he had any property. It was there at a kitchen table on Farwell Avenue, in a third-floor apartment where the elevator never worked, when a man handed his son an understanding of what it means to be right. Not just right in the momentary sense of having won, but right in the deep sense of having understood something true and committed it to record. That inheritance is worth more than $47.3 million. And here is the question I want you to carry with you when you leave this. Not what you would have done in that lobby, though that's worth thinking about. What has someone tried to hand you that you have not yet picked up? What notebook is sitting in a drawer somewhere, in your family, in your memory, in your own history, a thing that someone who loved you tried to give you and that you have not yet opened? Because the door was always there, and the key was always yours. Leave it in the comments. I want to know.